A 68-year-old black man in a faded college sweater sat quietly in an upscale steakhouse, nursing a glass of ice water. To the arrogant patrol officer who would soon seize him by the collar and drag him into the night, he looked like nothing more than another soft target for a cheap power trip. Officer Derek Sloan had no idea that the quiet figure he was about to humiliate was not a vagrant, not a troublemaker, and not a man who could be discarded without consequence. He was an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And by the time the sun rose over the Potomac, Sloan's career would not merely end. It would be reduced to ash. The Oak Room needed no neon sign. Nestled in the moneyed heart of McLean, Virginia, scarcely a dozen miles from the marble halls of Washington, D.C., it was a temple of dark mahogany paneling, leather-bound menus, and conversations conducted in careful half-tones. Senators carved dry-aged rib eyes while negotiating the fate of bills. Tech barons raised $1,000 bottles of Cabernet over acquisition toasts. Exclusivity was the house religion, enforced with quiet ruthlessness by the maitre d' and the night manager. On a sharp Tuesday evening in late October, October 21st to be precise, the restaurant hummed with its usual dinner service. At a corner booth shielded from the main floor's glare sat Associate Justice Everett Langston. To casual eyes, he looked nothing like a man who could reshape the architecture of American law. 68 years old, beard neatly trimmed and heavily salted with silver, he carried the quiet, watchful exhaustion of a mind that had spent decades dissecting the hardest questions a free society can ask. After 2 grueling weeks buried in appellate dockets, Langston wanted only a simple dinner with his daughter, Claire, who was fighting her way out of Georgetown traffic. He had left the tailored suits and silk ties hanging in the closet of his Georgetown residence. Tonight, he wore dark corduroy trousers, sensible loafers, and a faded Navy Yale law sweater that had survived better decades. No flashy watch, no rings except a plain gold wedding band. He looked like any other grandfather waiting patiently for family. But Everett Langston was no ordinary man. He was an Associate Justice known for a mind as sharp as a scalpel, an unwavering devotion to civil liberties, and a courtroom presence so soft-spoken it somehow intimidated more than any raised voice ever could. He sat reading a thick hardcover biography of the Reconstruction era, turning pages with deliberate care, occasionally lifting the water glass to his lips. The reservation had been made under Claire's last name. Langston wanted no fanfare, no frantic fawning, no whispered recognition that would turn a quiet meal into a spectacle. Unfortunately for him, his quiet presence had already drawn the wrong kind of attention. Timothy Harlow, the night manager, was a nervous, status-obsessed man in his late 30s who treated the restaurant's unspoken hierarchy like sacred scripture. For 20 minutes he had watched Langston from the hostess stand, eyes narrowed. In Harlow's cramped and prejudiced worldview, the casual clothes and the color of Langston's skin simply did not fit the Oak Room's brand. "Who seated him?" Harlow hissed at the young hostess, jabbing a discreet finger toward the corner booth. "He has a reservation, Mr. Harlow," she answered, puzzled. "Under the name Langston." "I don't care about the reservation." Harlow yanked at his too-tight tie. "Look at him. He's loitering. He's been nursing that water for 20 minutes. He's making the other guests uncomfortable." The hostess glanced around. The other diners were lost in their own expensive conversations, completely oblivious. "He said his daughter's stuck in traffic on the Beltway. He's just waiting." "He doesn't belong here," Harlow muttered, bias clouding whatever thin judgment he possessed. "I'm not having some vagrant occupy a prime table and ruin the atmosphere." Instead of walking over and speaking like a professional, Harlow made the decision that would ignite everything. He stepped into his back office, lifted the phone, and dialed the Fairfax County Police non-emergency line. He requested an officer to remove a suspicious, uncooperative individual who was refusing to leave private property. 12 minutes later, exactly 8:12 p.m., A patrol cruiser eased up to the curb, red and blue lights washing the restaurant's brass fixtures in cold color. Officer Derek Sloan stepped out, adjusting his heavy utility belt with the practiced swagger of a man who believed the badge made him a king. 32 years old, Sloan had a thick file of excessive force complaints that had always vanished under the protective wing of a union representative who happened to be a family friend. He thrived on the fear the uniform inspired. He loved the submission it demanded. Inside, Harlow met him with frantic gratitude. "Officer, thank you for coming so fast. He's over there in the corner. I need him trespassed immediately. He's refusing to order, and frankly, he's scaring the clientele." Sloan cracked his knuckles, a smirk already forming. "Don't worry about it, Tim. I'll handle this. Let's take out the trash." Langston was deep in a chapter on the Reconstruction Amendments when a heavy hand slammed flat onto the mahogany table, rattling the water glass. He looked up slowly, closed the book, and carefully marked his place with one finger. Then he met the aggressive, challenging stare of Officer Sloan. "Let's see some ID, buddy," Sloan barked, loud enough to turn heads at nearby tables. Langston did not flinch. He did not scramble for his wallet. He simply adjusted his reading glasses and regarded the officer with the same calm, analytical gaze he used to dismantle unprepared counsel before the highest court in the land. "Good evening, officer," he said, voice a rich, measured baritone. "Is there a problem?" "The problem is you're loitering on private property." Sloan leaned in, using size and proximity as weapons. "Management wants you out, so you're going to stand up, show me your ID, and walk out that door before I put you in cuffs." Langston glanced past Sloan and saw Timothy Harlow hovering near the bar, watching with anxious satisfaction. Understanding arrived instantly. Langston had lived through the civil rights movement. He recognized the ugly, familiar face of profiling the moment it appeared. In that moment, he could have ended everything with 3 quiet words. "I am a Supreme Court justice." He could have produced federal credentials. He could have watched the officer's face collapse. But Everett Langston was a man of profound principle. He wanted to see exactly how a citizen of this county, without title, without power, without a famous name, was treated by those sworn to protect them. "I have a reservation," he said calmly. "I am waiting for my daughter, who is currently stuck in traffic. I am doing nothing illegal, nor am I disturbing anyone." "I don't care about your sob story, old man." Sloan's patience evaporated. "People like you think you can just wander into places like this and do whatever you want. I said let's see the ID now. I am under no legal obligation to provide identification simply for sitting in a restaurant," Langston replied, tone still perfectly level, though his eyes had sharpened. "Unless you are articulating a reasonable suspicion that I have committed a crime, I will remain right here." The invocation of actual law infuriated Sloan. To a bully, nothing is more threatening than an educated target who refuses to be afraid. "Oh, we got a constitutional scholar here," Sloan mocked loudly enough for half the dining room to hear. "You want to play lawyer? Fine." Without warning, he reached across the table, seized the collar of Langston's Yale sweater, and violently yanked the 68-year-old man out of the booth. Langston's knee slammed hard against the heavy wooden edge. Gasps rippled through the restaurant. Forks clattered onto porcelain. "Get your hands off me," Langston said, warmth gone from his voice, replaced by cold, hardened steel. "You're trespassing," Sloan growled, twisting the older man's arm behind his back into a brutal compliance hold. "You're leaving one way or another." He marched Langston through the center of the dining room. The justice offered no physical resistance. He knew better than to fight an aggressive officer in the heat of the moment. But as he was paraded past the silent, staring patrons, he did one thing. He turned his head and locked eyes on the silver badge pinned to Sloan's chest. Sloan, badge 7422. Sloan shoved him through the heavy glass doors. Langston stumbled onto the concrete sidewalk, barely catching his balance before he fell. "And don't let me catch you in this neighborhood again," Sloane spat, jabbing a thick finger at Langston's chest. "Take your attitude somewhere else before I decide to lock you up for resisting arrest." With a final contemptuous glare, the officer turned, walked back into the warmth of the restaurant, and let the doors swing shut. Langston stood alone on the chilly sidewalk. He straightened his torn sweater, brushed a speck of dust from his trousers, and drew a slow, deep breath. His knee throbbed viciously, but his mind was crystal clear. The era of giving corrupt men the benefit of the doubt was over. 2 minutes later, 8:14 p.m., a sleek black Mercedes sedan pulled aggressively to the curb. The driver's door flew open and Claire Langston rushed out. 35, a brilliant corporate litigator in her own right, she was fiercely protective of her father. She saw him standing on the sidewalk, massaging his shoulder, staring through the glass into the restaurant. "Dad," she called, running over. "What are you doing out here? I thought you were inside. Why is your sweater torn?" Langston turned to his daughter. He offered a small, reassuring smile, though his eyes remained utterly cold. "There was a slight misunderstanding with the management, Claire. It seems my presence was not desired." Claire's brow furrowed. She looked past him and saw Officer Sloane standing near the hostess stand, laughing with Timothy Harlow while sipping from a complimentary to-go coffee cup. She looked back at her father's torn collar and the slight limp in his stance. The truth hit her like a freight train. "Did that cop put his hands on you?" Her voice dropped to a dangerous, lethal whisper. "Dad, did that officer touch you?" "He forcefully escorted me off the premises," Langston answered simply. Claire's eyes blazed with a fury that could melt steel. She turned toward the restaurant, hands balling into fists. "I am going in there right now. I am going to tear that place down to the studs. I am going to have his badge, his pension, and his house." Langston reached out and gently caught her arm. "Claire, stop. Dad, you are a sitting justice of the Supreme Court. That jumped-up rent-a-cop just assaulted you because of what you look like." "I know exactly what he did," Langston said quietly. "And you will not go in there and scream. We do not throw tantrums on the sidewalk. We operate within the parameters of the law." "The law?" Claire scoffed, tears of rage already stinging her eyes. "He just broke it, and he will answer for it," Langston replied, voice carrying the immense, crushing weight of his authority. "But we will not give him the satisfaction of a public screaming match. Get in the car, sweetheart. Let's go home." Reluctantly, furious, Claire opened the passenger door for her father. Once they were sealed inside the quiet luxury of the Mercedes, she gripped the steering wheel and waited for instructions. Langston did not ask her to drive. Instead, he reached into his pocket, withdrew his phone, and scrolled past the emergency numbers until he found a private contact. He pressed call. Inside the Oak Room, Derek Sloane was feeling invincible. He had asserted dominance, protected his territory, and earned a free hazelnut coffee. He slapped Harlow on the back, promised to keep an eye on the parking lot, and strode back out to his cruiser. As he drove away through the affluent, tree-lined streets of McLean, listening to the idle chatter of the police scanner, he remained completely oblivious to the fact that an invisible countdown timer had just been welded to his life. In the parked Mercedes, Langston raised the phone to his ear. It rang twice. "Langston, it's late. To what do I owe the pleasure?" The voice belonged to Robert Callahan, Chief of Police for Fairfax County. Callahan was a stern, by-the-book veteran who had served on multiple federal justice reform task forces alongside Langston. The mutual respect between them ran deep. "Good evening, Robert," Langston said evenly. "I apologize for calling your personal line so late, but I'm afraid a rather troubling incident has just occurred." The casual warmth in Callahan's voice vanished instantly, replaced by sharp professional concern. "Troubling? Are you all right, Everett? What happened?" "I am physically fine, aside from a bruised knee. However, roughly 10 minutes ago, while waiting for my daughter at the Oak Room in McLean, I was physically assaulted and forcibly removed from the premises by one of your patrol officers. Dead silence fell across the line. When Callahan finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. You were what? Are you sure it was one of my men? He was wearing your department's uniform, Langston replied. He refused to ask for context, demanded identification without probable cause, utilized a painful compliance hold, and dragged me out of the building. He told me, and I quote, not to let him catch me in this neighborhood again. In his home office, Chief Callahan closed his eyes as a cold sweat broke across his forehead. He knew Everett Langston. He knew the justice was not a man who exaggerated. If Langston said he had been assaulted, he had been assaulted. The sheer magnitude of the political, legal, and public relations catastrophe about to descend on the department was almost unfathomable. Everett, my God, I am so profoundly sorry. Callahan's mind was racing. Did he know who you were? I chose not to disclose my occupation, Langston said. I wanted to experience his standard operating procedure. And Robert, if this is his standard procedure for a quiet, elderly citizen, I shudder to think how he treats the young people in your jurisdiction. I need a name, Everett, right now. Give me his name. Officer Derek Sloan, badge number 7422. Callahan wrote the name on a legal pad with such force the pen nearly tore through the paper. Where are you now? Sitting in my daughter's car outside the restaurant. I am going home to ice my knee and finish my book. I expect you will handle this administratively, Robert. Administratively is just the beginning, Callahan said, voice shaking with a potent mixture of embarrassment and rage. Everett, I give you my absolute word. By the time the sun comes up tomorrow, Officer Sloan will not just be unemployed. He will be facing criminal charges. Good night, Robert. Langston ended the call. He looked over at Claire, who was staring at him with a mixture of awe and residual fury. Put it in drive, Claire, he said gently, leaning back against the leather headrest. Let's find somewhere that serves a good burger. As the Mercedes pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the October night, the wheels of justice, silent, swift, and utterly unforgiving, began to turn. Chief Robert Callahan sat frozen in his home office long after the line went dead, the receiver still clenched in his hand. Outside, a light freezing rain had begun to fall, tapping rhythmically against the glass, but the sound barely registered. His heart hammered an uneven rhythm against his ribs. For 30 years, Callahan had worn a badge. He had navigated hostage situations, gang wars, and the treacherous political landscape of suburban Washington. But never in all those decades had he felt the pure, icy terror currently pooling in his stomach. An officer under his command had just physically assaulted Associate Justice Everett Langston. Callahan knew Langston. They had sat across from each other at symposiums on criminal justice reform. He knew the justice to be a man of unimpeachable character, a man who possessed a brilliant, quiet fortitude that commanded respect from every corner of the political spectrum. And a man wearing Callahan's own uniform had just treated him like a stray dog. Callahan could already see the apocalyptic fallout waiting at sunrise. The Department of Justice would descend like a swarm of locusts. The FBI would open an immediate civil rights investigation into the entire department. National news trucks would park on his front lawn. White cop drags black Supreme Court justice from upscale restaurant. It was not merely a career-ending headline. It was the kind of systemic failure that invited federal consent decrees and ruined municipalities. He stood so abruptly, his chair scraped violently against the hardwood. He bypassed his dress uniform, threw on a heavy tactical jacket over civilian clothes, grabbed his radio, his badge, and his sidearm. By the time he was in his unmarked SUV, tearing down the slick asphalt toward police headquarters, he was already making calls. First, Captain Victor Lang, head of internal affairs. "Tom, Victor, wake up!" Callahan barked into the Bluetooth, not waiting for a greeting. "Chief, it's midnight. What's going on?" Lang's voice was thick with sleep. I need you at headquarters 10 minutes ago. Wake your 2 best investigators and have them meet you there. And Victor, do not log this into the main dispatch system. We are operating entirely off the books until I have the evidence in my hand. What's the charge, Chief? The sleep vanished instantly from Lang's tone. Assault and battery, false arrest, deprivation of civil rights under color of law. Callahan's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. Against one of our own, Officer Derek Sloan. He ended the call and dialed a second number, Lieutenant Elena Vargas, night shift commander on duty. Vargas, this is Callahan. I am 2 miles out. I need you to dispatch a plainclothes detective unit to the Oak Room Steakhouse in McLean immediately. Have them locate the night manager, Timothy Harlow. They are to seize the restaurant's interior security footage from the last 2 hours. If Harlow hesitates, tell him they can either hand over the hard drive voluntarily, or I will wake a superior court judge and bring a SWAT team to execute a warrant. Right away, Chief. Vargas recognized the absolute, uncompromising edge in her commander's voice. Is there a specific incident they are looking for? An altercation involving Officer Sloan and an elderly black patron, Callahan said, voice tightening. Secure it. Nobody watches it until I get there. And ping Sloan's cruiser, GPS. I want to know exactly where he is, but do not, under any circumstances, alert him. Across town, the Oak Room was finally winding down. The last wealthy patrons were finishing their cognacs. Timothy Harlow stood by the hostess stand, feeling deeply satisfied with himself. He had protected the sanctity of his dining room. He had drawn a line in the sand. His smugness evaporated the moment the heavy glass doors swung open, and 2 detectives in dark trench coats walked straight past the hostess and stopped inches from him. Timothy Harlow? The lead detective, a hardened 20-year veteran named Ray Miller, asked flatly. Yes? Harlow's polite customer service smile faltered. Can I help you, gentlemen? If this is about the vagrant earlier, Officer Sloan already took care of it. We aren't here about a vagrant. Miller flipped open his leather credential case, gold shield gleaming. We're here for your server room. We need the raw security footage from the last 2 hours, specifically the dining area and the front entrance. Harlow blinked, sudden anxiety prickling the back of his neck. I don't understand. What happened? Did that man do something? Miller leaned in close, voice dropping to a gravelly, intimidating whisper. Mr. Harlow, you are currently standing on the edge of a very steep cliff. I highly suggest you don't ask questions and just hand over the hard drive. Now, trembling, Harlow led them to the back office. As Miller extracted the digital files onto an encrypted flash drive, Harlow wrung his hands. Look, I just called the non-emergency line because he was refusing to leave. I didn't want any trouble. The officer handled it. Miller pocketed the drive and looked at Harlow with a mixture of pity and absolute disgust. You have no idea what you've done tonight, do you, pal? You better call a lawyer, a good one. By 1:15 a.m., Chief Callahan stood in the windowless internal affairs briefing room at police headquarters. The air was thick and tense. Captain Lang and the 2 IA investigators stood silently against the back wall. On the large digital monitor, the security footage from the Oak Room played in stark high-definition color. There was no audio, but the visuals were damning enough. They watched Everett Langston sit quietly reading. They watched Officer Derek Sloan swagger into frame. They watched the brief, tense exchange of words. Then Callahan's jaw clenched so hard, his teeth ached. The room went deathly still as the footage showed Sloan reach across the table, violently grab the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court by the collar of his sweater, and yank him out of the booth. They watched the 68-year-old man stumble, his knee striking the heavy wood. They watched Sloan twist Langston's arm into a brutal compliance hold and march him out of the restaurant like a violent felon. Son of a bitch, Captain Lang whispered in the darkness. He didn't even ask for ID. He didn't establish a lawful order. He just went straight to physical violence. "It gets worse," Callahan said, voice a low, dangerous rumble. He turned to face his men. "Do any of you know who that man is? The man Sloan just assaulted?" The investigators looked closely at the frozen frame of Langston's face. "Wait," one of them breathed, stepping closer to the monitor. "Chief, is that—" "That is Associate Justice Everett Langston of the United States Supreme Court," Callahan confirmed. The words tasted like ash. A collective, horrified gasp sucked the oxygen out of the room. Captain Lang actually had to grab the edge of the conference table to steady himself. "Chief," Lang stammered, "the Union, Frank Donovan is going to—" "Frank Donovan can go to hell," Callahan snapped, eyes burning with ferocious, unrestrained fury. "I am not playing union politics tonight. I am not putting Sloan on paid administrative leave so he can sit on his couch and collect a check while the DOJ burns this department to the ground. This wasn't a mistake. This was a criminal assault under color of law, motivated by racial profiling, against a sitting federal judge." He slammed his hand onto the table. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. "Print the arrest warrants," Callahan ordered, voice ringing with absolute authority. "Assault, battery, official oppression. We are not calling him in. We are not giving him a heads up. We are going to rip the badge off his chest right now." At 2:30 a.m., Officer Derek Sloan was parked behind a darkened, closed-down strip mall on the outskirts of McLean. The rain had intensified into a steady downpour, drumming loudly against the roof of his cruiser. The engine idled, heater blasting, cabin a comfortable 70 degrees. Sloan was entirely at peace. Seat leaned back, half-eaten protein bar on his thigh. He scrolled mindlessly through a sports betting app. The incident at the steakhouse had already faded, filed away as just another routine exercise of authority. In his twisted reality, he had done society a favor by putting an arrogant, out-of-place old man in check. He felt untouchable. He was a cop in a wealthy county. He held the keys to the kingdom. He was so engrossed in his phone that he did not notice the headlights until they were right on top of him. Suddenly, 3 unmarked black SUVs and 2 fully marked police cruisers swarmed into the alleyway, cutting off every possible angle of escape. They boxed his cruiser with tactical precision. No sirens, just a blinding, chaotic explosion of red, blue, and searing white LED takedown lights illuminating the heavy rain. Sloan flinched, dropping his phone. His heart spiked. Armed robbery? Officer needs assistance? He hadn't heard anything on the radio. Before he could even unbuckle his seatbelt, the doors of the surrounding vehicles flew open. 6 men stepped out into the freezing rain. They weren't patrol rookies. They were the highest-ranking brass in the department. Through the glare, Sloan recognized the rain-slicked tactical jacket of Chief Callahan approaching his driver's side door. Flanking him was Captain Lang from Internal Affairs, looking like the Grim Reaper himself. Sloan rolled down his window, confusion morphing rapidly into a sickening sense of dread. "Chief? Captain? What the hell is going on? We got a major incident out here?" Callahan did not say a word. He stepped up to the door, reached through the open window, unlocked it from the inside, and yanked the heavy door open with enough force to rock the cruiser on its suspension. "Step out of the vehicle, Sloan," Callahan commanded. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a terrifying subterranean coldness that made the hairs on the back of Sloan's neck stand up. "Whoa, Chief, hold on a second." Sloan held his hands up defensively, but kept them dangerously close to his utility belt. "What is this? What's happening? Keep your hands exactly where I can see them and step out of the car. Now." Sloan slowly complied, stepping out into the freezing rain. The water instantly soaked through his uniform shirt. He looked around, completely bewildered, surrounded by high-ranking officers staring at him with expressions of unadulterated disgust. "Chief, you can't just roll up on me like this," he tried, summoning his usual arrogant bluster even as his voice cracked. "I know my rights. If this is an IA thing, I want my union rep. I want Frank Donovan on the phone right now." "Frank Donovan can't save you from this, Derek," Captain Lang said from Callahan's left, holding a manila folder shielded from the rain. "Nobody can." Callahan stepped squarely into Sloane's personal space. The chief was an inch shorter, but in that moment he looked 10 feet tall. "Unbuckle your duty belt," Callahan ordered. Sloane's eyes widened in genuine panic. Stripping an officer of his weapon in the field was the ultimate disgrace, a maneuver reserved only for cops deemed an immediate active threat to the public or themselves. "You can't do this," he protested, arrogance finally shattering into desperation. "What are you doing? I haven't done anything wrong. Is this about that guy at the Oak Room? Chief, come on. Management wanted him gone. He was trespassing. He was just some nobody who refused to show his ID." Callahan's expression remained entirely frozen. "He was a nobody," Sloane continued, voice rising. "An arrogant old punk who thought the rules didn't apply to him. I was doing my job." Callahan's hand snapped out with blinding speed. He grabbed the silver badge pinned to Sloane's chest and violently ripped it off the uniform, tearing the fabric of the shirt in the process. Sloane gasped, stumbling backward against the wet door of his cruiser. "That nobody," Callahan said, voice finally rising over the sound of the pouring rain, each word striking Sloane like a physical blow, "was Associate Justice Everett Langston of the United States Supreme Court." The words hung in the damp air. Sloane stopped breathing. All the color instantly drained from his face, leaving him looking like a reanimated corpse. The rain kept falling, running down his face like cold sweat, but he was completely paralyzed. His mind desperately searched for a punchline, a mistake, a misunderstanding. The absolute lethal seriousness in the chief's eyes confirmed the apocalyptic truth. The Supreme Court?" Sloane whispered, voice small, trembling, broken. "You violently assaulted a sitting federal judge," Callahan continued, tone merciless. "You bypassed every protocol, violated multiple civil rights, and committed felony assault under color of law. You dragged one of the most powerful legal scholars in this country out of a restaurant by his collar because you didn't like the color of his skin or the clothes he was wearing." I didn't know," Sloane stammered, knees literally beginning to buckle under the crushing, unfathomable weight of what he had done. Tears of absolute terror welled in his eyes. "Chief, please, I swear to God I didn't know who he was. If you had known, you would have treated him like a human being," Callahan interrupted, stepping closer until he was inches from Sloane's face. "That is exactly the point, Derek. That is exactly why you do not deserve to wear this uniform. You don't grant dignity based on a title. You grant it because it is your sworn duty." He turned his back on Sloane, disgusted by the sight of the sniveling man. "Captain Lang." Lang stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "Derek Sloane," he recited formally, stepping behind the disgraced officer and seizing his wrists. "You are under arrest for assault, battery, and official oppression. You have the right to remain silent." Sloane didn't fight. He didn't invoke his union rep again. He simply stood there crying in the freezing rain as his career, his freedom, and his entire life disintegrated into dust in the span of 30 seconds. The cold steel of the handcuffs ratcheted tightly around his wrists, the sound clicking loudly in the quiet night as he was shoved into the back of an internal affairs vehicle, transformed instantly from predator into prisoner. Callahan looked down at the silver badge in his hand, wet with rain. He shoved it into his pocket and walked back to his SUV. The sun hadn't even come up yet, but the reign of Officer Derek Sloane was already over. And the real storm, the legal reckoning that Everett Langston would unleash upon the department, the city, and Timothy Harlow, was only just beginning. By 6 a.m. on Wednesday, October 22nd, the sun began to peak over the Potomac River, casting long, cold shadows across the affluent suburbs of Washington. Inside Fairfax County Police Headquarters, the atmosphere was already a raging inferno. Chief Robert Callahan had not slept. He sat behind his heavy oak desk, drinking his fifth cup of black coffee, watching the national news networks on the muted television in the corner. The story hadn't leaked yet, but the silence felt like the agonizing pullback of ocean water just before a tsunami makes landfall. The door to his office swung open without a knock. Frank Donovan, the aggressive, bulldog-faced president of the local police benevolent association, stormed in. Donovan was a man who made his living defending the indefensible. For years he had shielded bad cops behind the impenetrable blue wall of silence, using union contracts and political bullying to force the department to retain officers who should have been stripped of their badges long ago. "What the hell is going on, Callahan?" Donovan barked, planting his hands on the chief's desk. "I wake up to a frantic call from Sloane's wife saying he didn't come home, and then I find out he's sitting in a holding cell at the county jail, and you bypassed union representation for his arrest. You're violating his collective bargaining rights, Robert. I want him released on personal recognizance, and I want him back on paid administrative leave by noon, or I'll have the mayor breathing down your neck so hard you'll choke." Callahan did not yell. He simply picked up a remote and pointed it at the digital monitor mounted on his wall. "Sit down, Frank," he said quietly, "and watch." He played the silent security footage from the Oak Room. Donovan stood with arms crossed defiantly, fully prepared to argue that Sloane had utilized standard escalation of force protocols against a non-compliant suspect. But as the footage rolled, Donovan's aggressive posture began to melt. He watched the unprovoked physical assault. He watched the brutal compliance hold on an elderly, unresisting man. "It's ugly, I'll give you that," Donovan muttered, shifting uncomfortably. He lost his temper, but it's a misdemeanor assault at worst. The guy was trespassing. Management wanted him gone. We can spin this. We say Sloane feared the suspect was concealing a weapon under that baggy sweater. We leak that the guy was being belligerent. Callahan paused the video on a high-definition, zoomed-in frame of the victim's face. "We aren't spinning anything, Frank," he said, voice dropping to a gravelly, lethal register. "Look at the man. Look closely." Donovan squinted at the screen. The confidence slowly drained from his face, replaced by a pale, sickly pallor. Who is that?" "That," Callahan replied, "is Associate Justice Everett Langston. He sits on the United States Supreme Court." Donovan physically staggered backward. His legs hit the edge of the leather guest chair, and he collapsed into it, staring at the frozen image of the Supreme Court Justice being violently manhandled by one of his union members. The blue wall of silence did not merely crumble, it was instantly atomized. "The DOJ is already mobilizing," Callahan continued ruthlessly. "The FBI Civil Rights Division is taking over the investigation. Sloane is being transferred to federal custody this afternoon. So, tell me, Frank, do you still want to hold a press conference and tell the world that your union stands behind a racist cop who violently assaulted a sitting federal judge? Because if you do, the federal government will open a racketeering investigation into this union that will put you in a cell right next to him." Donovan swallowed hard. He looked at Callahan, completely defeated. "He's on his own. The union provides no legal counsel for this. We sever him today." While Sloane was being abandoned by his only lifeline, a different kind of execution was taking place across town at the Oak Room. Timothy Harlow pulled his BMW into the restaurant's private parking lot at 9 a.m., holding a latte and whistling a cheerful tune. He expected a quiet morning of inventory. Instead, he found 3 black satellite news vans idling on the street and a cluster of reporters aggressively questioning the restaurant's owner, Richard Belmont. Belmont was a ruthless hospitality magnate who cared about exactly 2 things: his profit margins and his Michelin stars. As Harlow walked up to the front doors, Belmont spotted him. The owner's face was completely purple with rage. "Richard," Harlow said, faltering as he saw the murderous look in his boss's eyes. What's going on with the press? Did someone famous eat here last night? Get in my office, now, Belmont hissed, grabbing Harlow by the arm and dragging him inside, away from the cameras. Once the heavy oak door slammed shut, Belmont threw a thick manila envelope onto the desk. It landed with a heavy, ominous thud. "Do you know what that is, you absolute idiot?" Belmont screamed, spit flying. "That was hand-delivered 30 minutes ago by a courier from Langston and Associates, one of the most ruthless corporate litigation firms in Washington. It is a notice of intent to sue this restaurant, its parent company, and you personally for violations of Title II of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Harlow's latte slipped from his hand, spilling across the expensive Persian rug. "Civil Rights Act? What? Why?" "Because the quiet, elderly black man you decided to have physically dragged out of my dining room last night wasn't a vagrant," Belmont roared. "He was Everett Langston, a United States Supreme Court justice. You racially profiled a federal judge, you imbecile. You called a corrupt cop to throw him onto the street." Harlow felt his knees give out. He slumped against the doorframe, mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. I just thought he didn't look like he belonged." "You are fired," Belmont said, voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. "You are completely blacklisted. You will never work in hospitality in this time zone again. And when Claire Langston's law firm is done tearing you apart in federal court, you will be paying off the damages for the rest of your natural life. Get off my property before I have you arrested for criminal negligence." Timothy Harlow stumbled out the back door of the restaurant, completely shattered. In less than 12 hours, his prejudice had cost him everything. But Everett Langston was not a man satisfied with mere revenge. He was a man of the law. And as he sat in his magnificent wood-paneled chambers at the Supreme Court that morning, carefully icing his bruised knee, he was preparing to unleash a legal storm that would clean the rot out of the county forever. 6 weeks later, the federal courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia, was a fortress of security and media presence. The trial of Derek Sloan had not dragged on for months. Faced with the devastating high-definition security footage, the utter abandonment of the police union, and a relentless prosecution led directly by the U.S. Attorney's Office, Sloan's defense attorney had desperately sought a plea deal. The federal prosecutors, heavily influenced by Claire Langston's unforgiving back-channel pressure, refused to negotiate. Sloan was forced into a blind plea of guilty to federal charges of deprivation of rights under color of law and felony aggravated assault. Now it was time for sentencing. Inside the massive courtroom, the gallery was packed shoulder to shoulder. Sitting in the very back row, deliberately away from the cameras and the chaos, was Everett Langston. He wore a masterfully tailored charcoal suit, his demeanor calm, observant, and completely unreadable. He had not given a single public interview. He had not gone on television to boast or complain. He simply let the justice system, the very system he had sworn his life to uphold, do its work. The side door opened, and Derek Sloan was led into the courtroom. The transformation was jarring. Gone was the swaggering, heavily armed predator who had patrolled the streets of McLean. Sloan now wore a shapeless bright orange federal inmate jumpsuit. His wrists and ankles were bound in heavy steel chains that clinked loudly against the polished marble floor. He looked pale, gaunt, and absolutely terrified. As Sloan shuffled to the defense table, he nervously glanced into the gallery. His eyes met Langston's. Langston did not glare. He did not smile. He merely looked at the broken man with a quiet, devastating pity. Sloan immediately looked down at his chained hands, unable to hold the gaze of the giant he had so foolishly tried to crush. The Honorable Walter Price, a no-nonsense federal judge with a reputation for merciless sentencing, took the bench. He looked down at Sloan as if examining a cockroach. "Mr. Sloan," Judge Price began, voice echoing through the silent room. "Law enforcement officers are entrusted with an extraordinary amount of power. They are given a badge and a gun to protect the vulnerable. You, however, used your badge as a weapon of intimidation, fueled by deeply ingrained racial prejudice and a grotesque sense of entitlement. Judge Price picked up a thick binder from his desk and dropped it loudly. This court has reviewed the findings of the Department of Justice investigation, he continued. What makes this case truly horrifying is not just who you assaulted on that night in October. It is the twist that this investigation uncovered. Because the victim was a Supreme Court justice, the FBI dug into your past. They found 7 buried internal affairs complaints, 7 instances where you brutalized, intimidated, and falsely arrested working-class citizens of color in this county. You got away with it because they didn't have the money or the power to fight back. You thought Everett Langston was one of those voiceless people. Sloan began to silently weep, shoulders shaking as the reality of his exposure was laid bare before the world. You picked the wrong man, Mr. Sloan, Judge Price said coldly. And in doing so, you have finally answered for the 7 victims you thought the world forgot. The judge raised his gavel. Derek Sloan, for the crimes of felony assault and deprivation of civil rights, I sentence you to 96 months in a federal penitentiary, to be followed by 10 years of supervised release. You are permanently stripped of your right to own a firearm, and you are barred from ever holding public office or law enforcement credentials in the United States. Take him away. The gavel slammed down like a thunderclap. 2 massive federal marshals seized Sloan by the arms and dragged him out of the courtroom. As the side door swallowed the disgraced cop, Everett Langston quietly stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out the back doors of the gallery, completely unnoticed. The fallout from that fateful Tuesday night reshaped the entire region. Because of the horrifying pattern of abuse uncovered during Sloan's investigation, the Department of Justice placed the Fairfax County Police Department under a federal consent decree. Chief Robert Callahan used the mandate to completely purge the precinct, firing 6 other officers with histories of excessive force and completely restructuring the use of force training protocols. The police union, battered and terrified of federal indictments, was forced to accept the reforms without a fight. Timothy Harlow, completely ruined by the media circus, was forced to file for personal bankruptcy after Claire Langston secured a massive civil settlement against him. The Oak Room, hemorrhaging elite clientele who wanted nothing to do with a racial profiling scandal, eventually fired Richard Belmont, rebranded, and underwent a complete change of ownership. A year later, on a crisp autumn evening, a sleek black Mercedes pulled up to the curb outside a beautiful newly renovated restaurant in McLean. Claire Langston stepped out wearing a sharp business suit and opened the passenger door. Everett Langston emerged, wearing his favorite faded Yale law sweater and comfortable loafers. As they walked through the glass doors, the new manager, a warm, highly professional woman who had been hired specifically to change the toxic culture of the establishment, greeted them immediately. She did not look at Langston's clothes. She did not look at his skin color with suspicion. She looked at him with the standard baseline respect that every human being deserves. "Good evening, folks," she smiled warmly. "Table for 2? "Yes, please," Langston replied, rich baritone voice echoing softly in the foyer. Under the name Langston. As he sat down at his booth, he opened his thick hardcover book, took a sip of ice water, and smiled. The meal, he knew, was going to be excellent, and the peace in the room was exactly as it should be. True justice is not merely about punishing the wicked. It is about using moments of darkness to shine a light on the systemic rot that hurts the voiceless. Everett Langston never needed to shout his title to prove his worth. By simply letting an arrogant cop expose his own true nature, he dismantled a corrupt system from the inside out. It is a powerful reminder that respect should never be tied to a title, a suit, or a badge. It belongs to everyone,